Awesome. We are going to talk about object-oriented programming in JavaScript. And honestly, the big takeaway is JavaScript is not an object-oriented programming language. Even though it has objects, JavaScript object is not really the same as a Python or a Ruby object or a Java object. To use examples of languages which are like proper object-oriented languages. Even though JavaScript now has classes, and it didn't used to have classes, they work differently than classes in Python. I don't want to say they're not as powerful, but and they work differently than most other object-oriented languages. And forgive me while I get some water. And the JavaScript community uses classes some, but not a lot. And we will see why in a little bit. And I'm just going to apologize in advance if I don't see, if I miss questions in the Zoom chat or the hands up. I've got, actually, let me pull them up because I don't need to see Slack as much. So that'll work out
I can
great.
shout them out for you if you'd like.
Oh, excuse me. And Zainab, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah, so classes in JavaScript, we don't really do inheritance with JS classes. You will see JS classes used sometimes with React.js. So that's changing. We don't really use classes a lot when we teach React.js because React has moved away from them a bit. You will definitely see JS classes if you learn and use TypeScript, which is essentially a flavor of JavaScript that does a number of things, but relevant to this makes it feel more like Python. So why do we care about classes and object-oriented programming in JS? We will learn more about how the JS language works. You will see a different way of implementing object-oriented programming than with Python. And today is a little bit of a weird day to cover this because we kind of do return to Python, but especially if you go into front-end development or any role where you're doing more JavaScript, you will need to understand this stuff. And so we need to make sure that we cover it at some point. So I will say it's important knowledge as we get more into JS later. So just to reiterate, please don't try to code along today unless you feel really comfortable with that and have found it useful. Our assessment Friday is going to be a programming project that you have over the weekend that is going to be entirely in Python. This is more informational and to give you folks some broader context. So let me go ahead and say this. And let me go ahead and set some stuff up. In Python, we have self. In JavaScript, we have this. Both these terms address the same concept. Sort of. And we're going to look now at this in JavaScript. And it's a bit different. And again, don't stress out too much about this. One thing that's different and a little weird is that unlike in Python, if I just put self in there and ran it, I'm not sure what would happen, but probably not something good. In JavaScript, we can use this. It's not attached to an object. It refers to the context or scope surrounding where this, where the code that contains this is executed, not defined. And in a little bit, I may actually pop open a browser and show this. And actually, I could do that right now that I think about it, in a very simple way. And this also touches on one of the weirdnesses with JavaScript. We can run JavaScript in different environments. That program I ran just now, I ran using node.js, running it on my computer from the command line in the shell. Node.js takes the JavaScript engine from Chrome and bundles it up so we can use it on the command line. Now I'm using the console in the browser, which you can use to run JavaScript. My browser is Chrome, so we're again using the Chrome V8 engine, just like node.js. The big difference is that JavaScript running in the browser has access to the browser interface or application programming interface, essentially. And we see that there's an object called window that some of you might be familiar with. And it gives us all this information about the browser. And I don't remember the nifty tricks like off the top of my head. We'll see it more when we dig more into JS, but you can navigate to, like, you can use JavaScript to tell the browser to go to a page. Window location, yeah. So window.location.href. I am, through this window object, which interacts with the browser, essentially putting this URL, wikipedia.org, into the URL bar. Oh, and it's not a function. It's a property on an object. And when I change that, the browser sees that that's changed and takes us to Wikipedia. Point being, we get access to stuff, to browser stuff here. And here, when I ran this, it returned an empty object. this JavaScript file running on my computer with Node.js, it's called the global scope that a JavaScript program runs in, and there's nothing there. It's an empty object. Here, the browser does it a little differently, and we get access to like the window object, and that's a browser thing. Again, don't worry too much about mastering this stuff. The main point here is that, none of this would make any sense with self and Python and classes. And the JavaScript version of self is this, and we're already seeing that this works dramatically differently. And I'm just going to kind of continue sharing examples of that. And then in a couple minutes, I think I'll check in for a question. I'm just actually setting a timer. So to continue playing around with this, let's create an object, an empty object. This is, if I console log this, I would just see an empty object for Alice. Let's give our object a property. Alice has a name. Let's give our object another property. This property will hold a function. As we've seen, both JavaScript and Python have first-class functions where the value of a variable can be a function, and we can call that function by using the variable as sort of an alias. And here's where stuff gets kind of funny with this. Just as a quick reminder, this is just a way of combining data into a string in JavaScript, string concatenation with what's called a tag template literal. And let me comment that out. And now if I run this say hello command, I've got my Alice object. VS Code gives me great auto completion. Notice, by the way, VS Code is really smart, and it tells us a lot about JavaScript. It tells us this property name is a string. It tells us this property say hello is a function that doesn't take any arguments, and void means it doesn't return anything. VS Code is using TypeScript under the hood. Without getting into it too much, Microsoft created the language TypeScript to let us create real types in JavaScript to make it easier to write really big programs in JavaScript. VS Code itself is actually written in TypeScript. When I call this function, and I just need to move my zoom bar out of the way so I can see what's going on. This has access to this other property. So it's sort of like, what is going on here? Well, and actually, let me pull up. It's hard to, it gets tricky to talk about this. So I'm actually pulling up the MDN docs, which is really good. And which is actually where we're kind of pulling this lesson from. And we'll share this link, but you folks can see it here. They're doing kind of the exact same thing that we're doing. And I wanted to pull it up so I could highlight this, because it's tricky to talk about this stuff as we're all learning. This is determined how a function is called. The context or scope surrounding the function when it's called. So what happens here is when we call this function, JavaScript says, hey, where is this function getting called from? Well, it belongs to this property named say hello on this object Alice. So this context refers to the scope above this function. And hey, there is a property name there, so we're good to go. Just to demonstrate how terrible JavaScript is, I don't think this even throws an error. I think this just will print null. Yeah. Here's something that totally doesn't exist on that object. Now it does. What's it? Oh, I forgot a comma. Good news is my editor told me I forgot the comma. So again, this is weird and different, and why JavaScript can be a frustrating language in a lot of ways, and why we kind of avoid object-oriented programming with it. Python would give us errors that would help a lot more. And let me kind of just continue on with some interesting examples. Arrow functions work a little differently. Let's create Bob. Oh, there we go.
Adam, are arrow functions in JavaScript akin to Lambda functions? Or is it more like comprehension?
It's a great question. Not comprehension. They are very similar to Lambda functions, yes. I want to say like all functions in JavaScript are kind of like Lambda functions, but don't quote me on that. One of the big differences though between like a Python Lambda function and arrow function in JavaScript. Actually, let me. Yeah, and a Lambda function is kind of. Yeah, I did a quick Google search. JavaScript arrow functions are roughly the equivalent of Lambda functions in Python or blocks in Ruby. They're anonymous functions with their own special syntax. I'll share that link later too. The idea of a Lambda function is kind of transcends languages. Functions in JavaScript are really first-class citizens, even more so in Python. So in some ways, we don't need a Lambda quite as much. One of the big differences with arrow functions, with anonymous functions is, let me show it right now. Oh, I got that wrong. So here we used a function expression in JavaScript with the function argument. It binds this to the surrounding context. With an arrow function, the way arrow functions work in JavaScript is they don't bind this to the surrounding context. And so when we run this, name is an undefined property on this, which is confusing as heck. And if I did this, I think this will work. I'm not 100% if this works. Yeah, exactly. So this object exists in the global scope of the whole JavaScript program. It's pretty much just a JavaScript object that we stick properties on. Arrow functions don't bind this object to the context where this is called, to the context where the arrow function is called. And again, the point I want to make with all of this stuff is we use classes some, but not a lot, and we don't really do inheritance. And this is why. It's more confusing. And we're gonna see a little bit of like what JavaScript is doing under the hood. And it is interesting and potentially useful, but it's confusing and it never really caught on as the way that JavaScript was written. And so now the way that there is an idea of inheritance in JavaScript, but we will not use it very often. If you get further in your career and you're like writing a JavaScript library that other people use in your programs, and you need to go deeper into the language, you might use it then. What we're going to talk about is called prototypical inheritance. And it used to be that for roles involving JavaScript, being able to talk about the prototype chain and prototypical inheritance was a pretty common interview question for entry-level roles. I think that might be starting to change these days. But I'm not certain about that. You know, there are a couple other examples. I think I'll show one more example and then we'll move. We can maybe take some questions and maybe we'll take a break and then we'll move on. Because there's really only kind of two other topics we're looking here for. And again, the context with today's lesson is I'm curious to get feedback later on if this contrast with how classes and inheritance works in Python is useful. And also, especially because this comes up on interviews, but also because this is a core feature of the JavaScript language, it is useful and important to have some familiarity with this so that if you want to or need to later, you can go deeper. So let me show one more example in the vein of what we've been seeing, and then we'll do some questions and take a break. Let's say I want to kind of get the same feature where we're creating people and they can say hello, but I want to implement it a little differently. I'm going to create a function expression. We're going to console log this dot name. I'm using this term context a lot. We'll talk about it more when we get into JavaScript, but essentially, when I call this function, what is it called inside of? It's called inside of main.js. When we call say hello, it's called inside of the Bob object. So the Bob object is the context of this function. Kind of similarly, when I run my node.js program, this whole JavaScript program is running in the context of Node.js running in the shell on my computer. Over here, when I run this JavaScript code, that line of code is being executed in the context of the browser. And so this idea of like, it's like, what room of the house are you in? If you're in the kitchen, you can get something, you can go get a plate and get food from the fridge. If you're in the bathroom, you can get your toothbrush. If you're in the kitchen, you're in the wrong context to get your toothbrush. And similarly, if you're in the bathroom, you're in the wrong context to get food from the fridge. And this is like sort of a core programming concept that's very similar to scope, right? And let me kind of show this in action a little bit more with JavaScript. And this idea of context and scope are universal concepts in programming, and they're relevant in Python as well, especially with modules and with importing. And so hopefully some of this might help too a bit. I know people were asking about wanting to go more into kind of paths and importing and file paths. And if you can start to think about that when you run a Python program, it's running in the context of, and that would be my timer. Your Python program is running in the context of like, what directory do you run it in from the command line? That might help to start thinking of the bigger context when we're running our programs. I've been chatting a lot, so let me show these last two examples, and then we really will do some questions and take a break. So we're gonna have a couple people. Actually, what I'm gonna do to make my life easier is I'm going to copy Bob. I'm going to rename Bob to Dan. And then what we want to do here is we are going to create a property on the Dan object named say hello and assign it the value of, essentially, we've got a variable holding a function expression here. So we've got a function assigned to the say hello property on our Dan object. And we also want Eve. And these names are kind of classic programming problem lesson names because they go in alphabetical order. And let's see something interesting. Let me make sure. I'm going to get rid of this. We can come back to it later. So let's run our code. So here's where it gets interesting. This was sort of the reason why JavaScript was made the way it was, because it's potentially very powerful and flexible, but that flexibility is almost too much and counterproductive and becomes a problem because it's hard to keep code organized. We have this function named say hello. It prints out this dot name. This is going to refer to the context surrounding wherever this function is called and executed. We assign this function to this property on this object Dan and on Eve. When we call say hello for Dan, the context is the Dan object. So this dot name is Dan. When we call say hello for Eve, the context is the Eve's name object. So this dot name for Eve is Eve. We get to write one function. We don't even need to pass in an argument. It is kind of terrible. You really would want to pass in an argument. Like the style of programming we're seeing here creates a lot of what I think the term is coupling. Like, we can't just run this function and trust that it'll work. This stuff has to exist somewhere else. Well, if I had done this, I just know I have to pass the right arguments into the function. So there's a lot of power and flexibility here, but the cost is complexity. So that's a good point to check in and see what questions people have, and then we can take a break.
I just had a quick question on line 43 and 44. When you're calling the function, are you calling the, because line 40, you've got the key and the value there as say hello. Which one are you calling there?
Great question.
Is that,
yeah. This key say hello holds the function. So it does get a little tricky to talk about. What I would say is, like, I should be able to. It's not that different from what we did before. Like this. The difference is, rather than writing this here and writing it here and having, if there was more logic in this function, having that logic duplicated in multiple places, which can be its own problem because then when you want to change stuff, it's harder. We write that logic once in this function expression. We assign it to this variable. We then assign it again to this other property on this object. They just happen to have the same name. This might help a bit. What I'm doing here is I'm saying for this object, Dan, get this property, say hello, and execute it. And if say hello was not a function, I'm not sure what kind of error we would get, but we should get some kind of error. And we actually have a good error message for once. Say hello is not a function. So JavaScript lets you try and do whatever you want because a variable can be anything in JavaScript and there are no restrictions, which is good and bad. So when we do this, we kind of have to know that this object property holds a function. Does that help a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, no, that was an amazing question. Thank you so much for asking it, and like a very good one. And again, JavaScript can do some really cool stuff, but this is why we don't do that much with classes and inheritance, and we'll kind of even see more so in a bit. What else is on people's minds?
I had a quick question.
Yes.
Like a few months ago, I like listened to like a podcast and they were like explaining the keyword, and even they had like trouble explaining it and said like they personally didn't use this a whole bunch when they were coding in their career. So is that true for most programmers?
That is a really good question, and that is true. And in fact, I'm going to add that. Yeah, like, the exception is there is a class keyword in JavaScript, and we'll see it in a bit. And it feels a lot more like Python and self, and it makes more sense and it's easier to use this when we create a class in JavaScript. So there you will use it, but we won't even be creating a lot of classes. Outside of if you're doing a class, these days, best practice is to avoid using this context unless there's a particular reason, and sometimes there is, because it can be a bit confusing. Not can be, it is a bit confusing. It's really powerful, but basically we figured out if we're writing big programs with hundreds of files, this can be incredibly confusing. So with JavaScript, it's become a lot more about functions and using objects, sort of like Python dictionaries or like baby classes. The term is kind of like composition over inheritance, like combining different pieces instead of inheriting stuff. Yeah, so that's a great question.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think JavaScript used to use, or a lot of people who coded in JavaScript used to use the class-based paradigm versus functions, but now I think most people are going towards the functions. We'll see this also when we're doing React. React has also kind of shifted towards using functions. That's why it exists, but you will probably not use it.
Totally. Yeah, Zainab, that's a really good point. Thank you. That's pretty accurate. TypeScript is the big exception to that, but TypeScript is kind of its own beast. And the other exception could be like everyone was using classes with React until like 3 or 4 years ago. So if you join a team and a lot of that code base was written like 5 or 6 years ago, classes with React are still working fine. There's no reason to change all that stuff, so you might use it there. So it depends too on like the existing code base. But yeah, for new stuff, and like when you're looking at tutorials and things online, you will see less and less of classes. And classes didn't even used to exist in JavaScript at all. And we did all sorts of crazy stuff. When I started my career, I'll very quickly demonstrate this. This was sort of still something that we had to do. I'll actually let me give 2 quick examples and then we'll take a break. So we'll come back to that later, but you can do something in JavaScript called an immediately invoked function expression. To put it on 2 lines, I define this function expression and I call it right away. And then what that function returns is assigned to this variable. I could do it inside this console log statement too. And it would also work. The reason that this matters is because when Java for like until like I want to say 2000, JavaScript didn't have classes. The only way to get scope for anything in JavaScript was with variables. So if I did something like this, oh man, return. This isn't a great example. We may not get very far with this. But like, JavaScript doesn't even really have a concept of private variables. Well, now it sort of does with classes. But if you want to have a private variable, this guy here inside the function, you can't get access to it once the function's returned. Like we're returning this object and we only get access to what's on that object. It also solves the problem of JavaScript having like no scope in the global scope. Like you could add like 10 different script tag JavaScript files to an HTML page. And if you had the same variable on 2 of them, you'd throw an error and it would break the whole thing. Here, I can have this variable. It exists. Let me go ahead and use it. It exists inside the function. I can have another variable with the same name that exists outside the function in a different scope. And this is what we would call a module. And in fact, like, I think this is how JavaScript does classes under the hood. And the class keyword is just a little bit of syntactic sugar. I'm not 100% on that, but so just to kind of give a little bit of a JavaScript history lesson. We should take a break. I would say if you have a question, maybe throw it in the questions doc. How does 15 minutes sound? And then at 11:30 we can return, and we really don't have too much more to cover. We're just going to see a bit more about how JavaScript does inheritance and how if we do use classes in JavaScript, how we want to do that. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, awesome. Let's take 15 and then we can dive into like the prototype chain and class keyword. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.